as educators, it's uh, imperative that we have a sense of self, that we are, as Gardner calls in his multiple intelligence, that we have a keen idea of our intrapersonal self. Um, that means we must think seriously about what we believe in every aspect. In every aspect, we must think seriously. We must not believe that somehow or another we walk into a classroom for 180 days a year and don't think that our prejudice uh, affects our teaching. And we need to be serious with ourselves about what we believe, what our belief systems are, not just in education, but and as it relates to the culture. And we need to address those things so we can, again, make sure that we are not being a part of the ethic, right? That we're not being external forces, that we're promoting image, right? Also, what happens is when we start to think about the things that we don't want to think about, like what we like and don't like, the type of students we like and don't like, when we start to think about our own prejudice, it allows us to be vulnerable and allows us to be open, if only with ourselves. And I think that's a important part of the teacher reflection or the teacher research process is that we must be open with ourselves and vulnerable with ourselves. Teacher research is not just about objectivity because the teacher is the researcher. Okay, and I think I made that point earlier that we're not coming in objective because we take on two roles as a teacher and a researcher. So objectivity in teacher research is really about being self-aware, and that is what gives teacher research validity. Okay, that is what gives teacher research validity. Um, the other things that we must consider is time, and I mentioned that earlier. And hopefully, you guys are taking notes on what I'm saying. Time is critical um, when we talk about teacher research. You have to give yourself time to do the research. Now, the reality is your principal will not give you that time. It's uh, you just don't. It's just not budgeted in the school day. School boards don't give time for teacher reflection. Maybe they should, and they will only do it when they see the benefit of it, when they see teachers actually doing it, when they see teachers actually in large numbers publishing their findings in journals. Will we then value the teacher research process? But where we are right now at the moment, we have to make that time, and we have to make sure that that time is not interfering with the teaching process, the teaching and learning process in your day. Um, when you give yourself time, um, you allow yourself to conceptualize an idea clearly. Okay, you allow yourself to conceptualize the ideas clearly. Remember that flow chart that I put in. You have an inquiry based on a question or something that puzzles you. So it allows you to conceptualize that, so you can really nail down what that true inquiry is. It also allows you to think about what you take for granted. Allows you to think about what you take for granted. This is a part of being self-aware, right? It forces you to look at your assumptions, your stereotypes, your bigotry, because the reality is we do have preconceptions about things. We have preconceptions about everything that goes on in the classroom. And what teacher research is really about is challenging and collecting data on those preconceptions. Okay. So if the other thing we need to think about, even before we think about time and giving time to it, to what puzzles us and the questions we have about what we see in the classroom, um, we also need to think about purpose. And what purpose really does is purpose really starts to generate more questions. It raises more questions. Questions like, why am I interested in the inquiry? Who is this inquiry for? Is this inquiry for me, or is this inquiry for the students? Does it benefit? Who does it benefit? Who's it for? Where does it come from? Does it come from my experience? Does it come from something I heard on CNN or the BBC? Where does this inquiry comes from? And I think once you look at purpose, it'll help you define the time much better, how much time and effort, or whether you even want to give time and effort to what is puzzling you or the questions you may have. So you should look at purpose in order to shape the time that you want to put into, or let's call it budget, right? Let's call it budget time. And then the last piece that we should consider is the outcomes that we're expecting. So what are your expectations for doing the research, for collecting the data? How much time do you need for the inspection of what you expect, right? Because basically what teacher reflection is really about is inspecting our expectations and really challenging our preconceptions, right? And then think about the outcome as it relates to your intentions. You know, are your intentions really against mandates? The mandate that the principal came down with, or the school board, or a federal law, or an ultimatum a parent made? And we should consider this idea, these mandates, from an emic perspective. So when we take the ideas of purpose, time, and outcome, it really allows us to think about whether we want to dive in the pool. So teacher research is really about a juxtaposition of your core competencies. Remember that we talked about core competencies last week. So it's a juxtaposition of your core competencies. But if you haven't thought about who you are, then you cannot establish, or you don't have any core competencies. And so teacher research is a juxtaposition of your core competencies, which may be filled with preconceptions, against the ethic of society. Against the ethic of society. And as I said before, when we talk about teacher research, we must continue to think, and we must first have some guidelines or caveats. And I think I mentioned one already, that teaching always trumps research. Okay? We don't devalue the teaching and learning process for research. Okay? So we're not going to sit in the middle class pondering what puzzles us or who we are. We need to find the appropriate time to do that. Class time, instructional time is not the time to do that. However, the teacher must decide where that line lays between teaching, trumping research. And we must make sure that we're not bumping against the status quo. Okay? We're not bumping against the status quo, or we're not joining the status quo. So it's very interesting, isn't it? So you don't want to create conflict with your research. I'm not asking you the guys to go out there and be warriors and create problems and make the lives of your administrators or other teachers a problem. This is an internal thing for you. You are an island among yourself as it relates to this. And you get off that island when you create some findings that you can research with, that you can publish rather, or that you can share with your administrators or your team, so you can do you can maybe do professional developments, create groups and teams within the school that really allows teachers to showcase or give a voice to their what puzzles them, so you can help guide them through the process of teacher research. Some other things we need to think about before we actually start doing the research and making sure that we're not interrupting the teaching and learning or instructional time, is that we should consider that teacher research should not significantly differ from what you normally do in the classroom. So it shouldn't be dramatically different from what you're doing. All right. That's number one. And again, I hope you guys are writing this down. Secondly, it should only involve non-controversial and controversial goals. It shouldn't go against the culture of the school or the people that you're teaching. Again, you're not trying to create problems here. Number three, teacher research should not deny students of any educational benefits rather, that they would otherwise receive if you weren't doing the research. Okay, and this is the same thing that we would expect of a researcher coming into the classroom, right? So you have somebody from the university, they have something that they're researching. We would say, hey, look, you can come into my classroom, but you cannot, you can't interrupt the instructional day. So you have to do the same thing for yourself. 4, you shouldn't promise any direct benefits as a result. So you shouldn't say to your students or even to other teachers or administrators that as a result of this is going to happen. Okay, you shouldn't make claims. Okay? You shouldn't make such claims. Number 6, you should protect the student's privacy at all times. That's kind of a no-brainer. You should be looking to protect the student's privacy. And we should look at the data that exists and that can be collected. Okay. Now keep in mind that teacher research, as I said before, is different than large-scale research. In teacher research, you're looking to understand the relationship between teacher learning instead of just creating positive change. Okay. So you're not trying to necessarily change things when you're doing teacher research. You're trying to look at the relationship between teaching and learning. Going now to those questions. Remember that flow chart. We can go back for a second. We had this chart here, right? And we had inquiries and questions. Excuse me, questions, and what in the questions we have and what puzzles us, we form these inquiries, right? We form these inquiries. These inquiries are questions, and it's just like any other scientific research. We create hypotheses. Teacher research, those hypotheses, conceptions. All of those questions are not created equal. They're not created equal. Okay. So there's two types of questions that we can ask when we're talking about research. And this is whether it's large scale research or teacher research. There's two questions that we can ask. We can ask teacher questions or we can ask research. Okay? We can ask teacher questions. Teacher questions basically to solve problems in the classroom. They have a clear intent and it's formed around solving a teacher thing. Okay? So teacher questions are about solving an issue that's going on in the classroom. Why are my students failing the test? Why are my what can I do to improve my students' writing scores on the test, on the standardized test? How many reading selections should I have the students practice before I give them a test? These are all what we would consider teacher questions, right? And many times there's a concrete answer. In fact, all the time there will be a concrete answer. Whereas researchable questions are open-ended. Researchable questions really look to capture a phenomenon without judging. That's very important. I say without judging, because remember I said earlier that it's important that you look within yourself and see who you are and see what your preconceived notions are, what you are discriminatory about. Because when we ask these researchable questions in teacher research, we cannot judge. Researchable questions focus on the students and not the questioner. So in researchable questions, you're not worrying about what you can do or what's going on with you. It's about the students. So researchable questions are student driven. Ultimately, researchable questions rather, they look for understanding. And they ask further questions. So teaching questions, teacher problems. I wonder if I put food in the classroom, will that stop my students from wanting to go to the vending machines, which disrupts the instructional time? That would be a teaching question, right? Because that's a yes or no. Okay. Um, so let's look at some other questions here. What kind of listening activities do my students like? That would be a teaching question. Right? What is the impact of praise on group dynamics? What type of impact of praise? What is the impact, of praise on group dynamics? That is a pseudo researchable question. And what makes it a pseudo researchable question? Because of the phenomenon of what? Praise. But it could also be, it teeters the line a little bit because it's supposed there is an impact. Another question, how much oral correction helps students learn? How much oral correction helps students learn? This could be a teaching and researchable question because number one, it suggests the answer already by saying how much. Okay, so that would make it a teaching question because of how much. But if we remove the word much, now it becomes more of a researchable question. How does oral correction help students learn? Okay, it still supposes the answer because it still suggests that and somehow that oral correction does help. So we can change it a little bit more. We could change it a little bit more. So if we drop help from the question, then we can say, how do students learn from oral correction? How do students learn from oral correction? Well, again, there's still an assumption there. So let's recast that to make it a complete researchable question.
Hello.
Yep. So, hello? So let's recast that to make it a complete researchable question. Do students learn from oral correction? And if so, how? So as you can see there, we went from the question, how much oral correction helps students learn? We took it from a teaching question and we moved it towards a researchable question. Let's look at why do students take so long to break into small groups for group work? Why do students take so long to break into small groups for group work? Right? Now, if we take question 4 and we compare it to question 2, now question 2 was, what is the impact of praise on the group dynamics? And we say question 2 is definitely a researchable question. Pseudo, we have to phrase it a little bit better, but it's a researchable question. But if you compare that to the question, why do students take so long to break into small groups for group work? Then that definitely becomes, that is definitely a teaching question because there's a concrete answer that you're looking for, right? Why? So all we have to do is search for the reason why in the physical world, right? Is it because they don't have their books? Is it because they talk too much? Is it because the instructions were not clear? So we just look into the physical world and we can find the answer to that question. And when we find the answer to that question, then we can solve the problem, right? So if it's because they don't have their books, then the teacher next time will make sure they have their books before she divides them into groups for group work. So then the question becomes, all right, Ray, how do you take that question and make it a researchable question if it's a teaching question? So we can recast it and say, okay, how can I get students to form their groups more rapidly and efficiently? Okay. Here, there's more than one answer and it's open-ended. Okay. We can even make it more broader by asking the question, what happens when students are breaking into small groups? Now there's more. Okay. So the whole idea here is researchable questions There are no concrete answers. We can't really look into the physical world to find the answers. We really need to look at students and figure out what's going on in students' minds. Okay. Um, Teaching questions seeks answers to specific problems. They focus on a course of action, like questions 1, 2, and 4. Okay. Researchable questions are able to be researched because they're open-ended and they suggest many different answers in many different directions. Researchable questions look at phenomena. So what I want us to do now is look at a couple of tasks because I said this was going to be discussion based. And I want you to do the following task for me. Task 1. What inquiries do you have about your teaching? What I want you to do now is just create a list. Do not form them as questions, but form them as ideas and preconceptions. Take about let's take about 10 minutes to do that. I'm gonna give you a little time to do that. So think about the inquiries you have about your own teaching, what you experience, or whether you work in a traditional school or institute or online. What inquiries do you have about your teaching? Create a list of those inquiries. But I don't want you to form them as questions. Take 10 minutes and we'll come back and discuss some of the inquiries that you have. Now, when I say inquiries, I guess what I really mean, what puzzles you? What questions do you have that you have thought about in the past about your teaching? So take about 10 minutes. We'll come back in, I guess, let's see. We'll come back in 9:05. Yeah, we'll come back at 9:05 and we'll elicit some responses from you guys to figure out what questions you have, what puzzles you about your teaching. All right, we'll see you in 10 minutes. We got 4 more minutes, then we'll come back and ask the group about some of your inquiries or some of what puzzles you. All right, I'm going to attempt to unmute everyone. If it gets loud, then I'll mute everyone again. All right. That looks like that's not going to work. All right. So let's get some responses. Who wants to share some of the some questions, inquiries you might have about your team? Raise your hand. Anybody want to share some of the inquiries they have about their teaching?
I would if I can.
Thanks.
Okay. One of my inquiries was about classroom management,
Okay.
appropriation level appropriateness for teaching my students particular subjects,
Okay.
and identifying their different learning styles and aptitudes. Like if a student was more for haptics, if a student was logical, mathematical, if a student had a tendency toward music, just stuff like that.
Okay. So basically, what intelligence? So you're basically like going towards Gardner's multiple intelligence.
Yes.
So how do you identify a student who's visual spatial, or a student who's logical, or a student who's musical?
Even probably one of the newer ones that I've heard of is naturalistic, which is something I hadn't heard of. It's more like just been recently brought to me, and it's finding students that are really about about nature and liking things like that. So
So so
very curious about that.
yeah, so interesting because we talked about that last week, and we put that in our teacher fashion statements. So there's a lot of research, strong research, Jazz, that says you shouldn't be concerned with that. And what I'll do is I'll send you some of that research. It says that it's a novelty and that it's not grounded in any real pedagogical um, it's not grounded. Now, from what I believe and what I've seen, it does have value when we're talking about student profiling and needs analysis. Um, but outside of that, uh, value a lot of research has said that Gardner and even Gardner himself has said don't use it and don't try to apply it towards your teaching. So there's something and I'll if you send me your email, I'll send you some of the research that indicates that. Can you give me what was the first one that you said?
Classroom management.
Classroom management. So how would you let's go into task 2. How would you form that as a question?
If I wanted to make it a research question,
Well, no,
Make it a
just
research question or a teacher question.
form it as any question you want. Just form the question. How would that question look in your mind?
The first thing that jumped out immediately was for classroom management. Um, what is the most effective way to keep your students on task
Okay. What
in groups? What's the most effective way to keep your students on task in groups?
Great questions. A lot of teachers ask that question. What is the most effective way to keep your students on task while they're in learning groups? Um, what do you think that is? Is that a teaching question or a researchable question?
I think, well, when I said what's the most effective way, I made it close. I make it close and made a teacher question, but I think I should probably make it open. Like, are there effective ways to keep students in task during learning groups? Is there effective ways? So I'd probably say I'd like to make it open ended.
So, are there effective ways to keep students on task while they're in learning groups? What do you, Somebody chime in. What do you think about him recasting? He recasted his question. He started off with definitely a teaching question. What are the ways I can keep my students on task while they're in learning groups? Now he's saying, is that the question? Are there ways that I can keep my students on task while they're in learning groups? Anybody want to chime in? Unmute yourself and see if that's an answer. And yeah, go ahead.
I have what I would probably say is a preconceived idea about that. I think that if there is a reason or a goal for the students to be on that task, they are more likely to stay on the task. In other words, if there's some kind of reward, even if you have some kind of competition between two groups, they have more of a reason to want to stay on task.
All right. Okay, so now you're looking at it from a more emic standpoint, which is good. All right, so you're looking at it from an emic perspective. What reasons?
Yeah.
What I want you to do while we still talk to Jazz is write that down as a question, and then I'm going to ask you what that question is. Now, Jazz, let's go back to your recast question. You said, are there ways that I can keep, or that the teacher can, basically you're talking about the teacher, right? Keep students
Yes.
on task while in a cooperative learning group. Now, if we're trying to make that a researchable question, what's the fundamental problem with that question?
That is teacher based, not student based.
Absolutely. So how can we make that question student-based? And anyone can help Jazz out. Don't leave Jazz hanging out there. Someone help Jazz out. Think about, I know we're not, it would be better if we were live in person to break into groups, but let's use technology here. Okay, so we wrote, what makes students get involved to do activities and tasks? Aha, Roger. You see, Roger wrote, what makes students to do, I guess she means to do activities and tasks while in cooperative learning groups. What do you think about that, Jazz? What makes students get involved in tasks while they're in cooperative learning groups?
I think that's actually pretty awesome. I was kind of on that track, but Raja put it together nicely. I'm with it.
Right. So now let's vet
I'm 100% with it.
Let's vet that a little bit. Does the answer give a concrete solution? So does the answer provide the solution to the overall problem?
No, it doesn't.
Doesn't.
No, it
Because
doesn't. It requires some research. It requires to see what happens.
it also requires you to do what? Can you put your, can, by looking at the research alone, the data that you collect alone, will that provide you the answer?
No,
Okay, right. And why?
because if I'm collecting data, because I'm as a teacher, I got to do both, and I still have to put my biases on it regardless. I can't take away from the students interacting in the classroom. So just having data doesn't make sense. There has to be more. There has to be more to it. I have to actually enact it. I have to put it to action.
What's the more? And anyone can jump in. What's the more?
Is it self-reflection?
From self-reflection from who?
Your own self, well, putting yourself in the shoes of the students,
There you go.
and thinking what is their perception of your teacher or the classroom situation.
Well, that's not the question wasn't about the perception of your teacher. It was, but it may. But the interesting thing about it is that what you may collect that as data. That may become data that you find when you start asking student-based questions and you look at it from an emic perspective. You'll find that the reason why they are not staying on task in cooperative learning doing cooperative learning activities is because of something you're doing. So in Freeman's book, he gives a great example of this. He gives a great analogy. He says his daughter would come home and talk about the blue lion and how in the blue lion, everyone had to be quiet while they were on the blue lion. And he would ask his daughter, well, what is the blue lion? And his daughter would look at him like, the blue line. It's the blue line. Everybody goes to the blue line. And when you're on the blue line, you're quiet. Now, the daughter is looking at it from an emic perspective because she's in the classroom. She knows exactly what the blue line is, and she experiences the blue line every day. Dad doesn't know. He's not in the classroom. He's not familiar with the classroom. He's etic at this point. So he's asking etic questions. Well, how big is the blue line? Well, big enough for everyone to sit on it. Well, hold on. Is everyone sitting on it? It has to be is it a chair? Is it a bench? Is it a plush animal? Right? He couldn't get around the idea of what this blue line was until he visited the class. And he found that the blue line was nothing more than a circle of masking tape that all the kids sat in a circle that the teacher called the blue lion. So that's the issue of etic and emic. And if we ask the wrong questions, we're not going to get the data that the data is going to actually give us understanding to the inquiry that we have, to what puzzled us in the first place. And this is very, very important. This is why I wanted to take the time to really deal with teaching questions versus research questions before next week we get into the how. So, Sonia, I asked you to recast your question or your statement rather, or turn your statement into a question. Did you have the opportunity to do that?
Okay, I'll try.
We're
What do students expect of me to keep them engaged in the task?
All right. Does anyone have any comment about that question? What do students expect of me to keep them engaged in the class?
Are you asking us to recast the question, or
Yeah, or what do you think about that question as a researchable question?
I think it's still a bit more teacher based. What do the students expect of me? Is it possible we can take just the teacher out of the question and just keep it focused on maybe what are students' expectations to stay focused? Maybe that might help a little more.
And then we can take it a step further, right? We can say, we could take, because we're supposing that they even have expectations, right? So what about, do students have expectations of what is going to be, of tasks, of activities in the classroom? And if so, what are they? What about that?
Yes.
All right, Mona says,
I'm
maybe
with it.
expect clarification from the teachers and move on. Okay. Praveen says, is it the relationship between how students rate their teacher and how much they learn? So now you see how, now I'm making a point. Hopefully I'm making the bigger point. When we move towards researchable questions, you see how everyone now has different perspectives of that question? Now from Jazz's one question about group work, we have chimed in and had a perspective. Mona chimed in, Praveen. Farah says it depends on how clear and effective the instructions are. Now, all of these statements we could turn into researchable questions. Now, that doesn't, let me say this. It's not like teaching questions are bad things. Teaching questions are okay to ask. That's a reality. We have problems in their question. We have problems in our classrooms. We're confused about something, and we say, "Hey, look." Especially, hopefully, we're able to go to a more experienced teacher and say, "Hey, look, I'm having this problem in my classroom. How can I fix it?" Don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with doing that, guys. Nothing wrong. That's very human, and it's good. The only thing that we're saying is that we need to move towards reflection, and reflection, just like in regular research, deals with open-ended questions. Okay, which drives me to my next and final point: first order questions versus second order questions that we need to consider. And first order questions and second order questions, they're not necessarily, they don't translate into teaching questions are first order, and second order are researchable questions. They don't necessarily translate, because you can have a teaching question that can be first and second order. Okay, you can have a researcher question that can be first and second order thinking. About that last week, as far as what first and second order thinking is. Just to refreshing your memory, remember that first order research deals with progress. Order thinking, rather, deals with progress. So when you go to the experienced teacher and say, I'm having this in my classroom, what can I do to improve it? There's nothing wrong with that, but understand one little problem with that. Can anybody tell me that from last week? Tell me what that problem is. We talked about it from last week. When we only ask first order questions, or we only ask teaching questions. Anyone want to chime in? It has something to do with the post-method condition, why the post-method condition was, we even considered a post-method condition. No, no one? Okay, no problem. The reason why we don't always want to just ask first order thinking questions or even teaching questions all the time is because they only address the needs that you have for the moment, in the moment. Okay? They only address what's going on right then and there. They hear me now with the students right in front of you. If you try to apply, those things, though that strategy or that method to the next group of students, it may or may not work. Why? Anybody can tell me why? Why might it work?
Student changing, needs are changing.
The students' needs are changing. It's a different group of students, different dynamics. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, you're right, Jazz. It's a different group of students, and each group of students have different needs. The group and the individuals. So that's why second order thinking and researchable